Good afternoon. I'm Sherry Sylvester. I'm a distinguished senior fellow here at the Texas Public Policy Foundation, and this is The War on Texas Identity, 1620 to 1836. Thank you for joining us today. I am going to talk with Dr. Peter Wood, Ernesto Rodriguez, who is the curator of the Alamo, and Dr. Don Frazier. But before I introduce each of them properly, I want to make a couple opening remarks to kind of let you know why we're having this panel and how we got here. As we all know, liberty, independence, and perseverance are part of our DNA as Texans. It's what we take from the spirit of what it means to be American, and it beats in every heart. The woke efforts to undermine who we are by attacking us, not only politically, we fight that battle all the time, culturally, we fight that battle all the time, but we're also seeing a renewed attack on our history, undermining our thinking about who we sense and who we know we are. In 2019, the book 1619 was written. It attempted to tell the story of America in a new way, from a single point of view. These were not new ideas, as Dr. Wood will tell you. They've always been on the fringe of American elite intellectualism, but they have become mainstream. 1619 was not written by historians, it was written by journalists. We're going to talk about that a little bit. In Texas, journalists, not historians, have launched several similar attacks on the history of Texas. Again, focusing on one thing, one issue. What we know about our history and how we understand it is coming full circle in the way we are seeing the world. Last week, our president told us that those who did not agree with his federal election reforms proposal, which includes 88% of all Texans who are opposed to it and 77% of all Americans who are opposed to it, that we were on the side of former Alabama Governor George Wallace, former Alabama Sheriff Bull Connor, and Jefferson Davis, the President of the Confederacy. This is not the way we as Americans understand ourselves, and it's not the way we understand our history. But our president used our history to undermine us. He tried to attack us with history. It's always been debatable who would write history and who would shape our country. One of my favorite quotes from John Adams, he was very worried about how history would record him. He knew Jefferson would get all the glory. He didn't think he'd be mentioned at all. And he actually said, the essence of the whole American Revolution will be that Dr. Ben Franklin's electrical rod smiled the earth, and out sprang George Washington, and the two conducted all the policy negotiations, all the legislation, and won the war. So Adams would probably be happy to know that a movie about his life won 4 Emmys and a Golden Globe. It's no surprise that Texas is ground zero for these discussions, and that's why I'm very pleased to have the scholars that we have with us today. Let me tell you about them. Dr. Don Frazier is director of the Texas Center at Schreiner University in Kerrville. He's the award-winning author of 6 books on the Civil War, including Blood and Treasure, Cotton Clads, and Fire in the Cane Field. He's very involved in public history. He's going to talk to us about what that is, working on the Civil War and frontier heritage trails in Texas, New Mexico, and Louisiana, and on historical projects in Europe and Mexico. He is elected member of the prestigious Philosophical Society of Texas and a fellow of the Texas State Historical Association. He's an advisor to the State Board of Education and Governor Abbott recently appointed him to the Advisory Committee for the Texas 1836 Commission. That's Dr. Frazier in the middle. On the end is Ernesto Rodriguez, who is the senior curator and historian at the Alamo. He has devoted over 20 years to historical research at this incredible site. As curator, Ernesto is dedicated to the scholarly research that underpins both the new interpretive planning for the Alamo Museum and a greater understanding of the Alamo's archives and artifact collections. He has a bachelor's and master's degree in history from St. Mary's University in San Antonio. And seated next to me is Dr. Peter Wood. Dr. Wood is president of the National Association of Scholars. He's a former professor of anthropology and a college provost. He's the author of Wrath, America Enraged, and 1620, a critical response to the 1619 project. He's also the author of several books about American culture, including Diversity, The Invention of a Concept, A Bee in the Mouth, Anger in America Now, which is a great book if you haven't read it. He is editor-in-chief of Academic Questions, a journal. And in 2019, he received the Jean Kirkpatrick Prize for contributions to academic freedom. I want to start with Dr. Wood, because we were having a discussion before you all came in, and ask him, why now? Has there been a time in the past when we've had what seems like a watershed attack on our history like we're having now?
The attack on American history began long before the moment in which the American public became The attack on American history began long before the current public wave of distaste. I thought this was taken care of.
Yes. They assured us it was working.
Okay, let's take number 3. The attack on American history goes way back, long before the current wave of distaste from parents in Virginia and other states over what's going on with critical race theory. It's broken out into the open, I think, first of all, because of the COVID shutdown and parents being able to see what's actually being taught in their schools. But before that, I think the events of 2020 became the thing that thrust this out into the open. That is, after George Floyd's death in Minneapolis, we had riots across the country. And in the midst of that, there were 2 reactions that I would point to. One was that college presidents across the land began issuing statements saying that their institutions were guilty of institutional racism. I collected over 400 of those in my role at the National Association of Scholars. And I wrote to every one of those presidents saying, "Oh, I'm really surprised that you consider your college to be racist. Could you tell me exactly what it is that made you say that?" None of them replied. Because there was nothing there to say, but nonetheless those declarations were the opening of a wave across the country of every college and university department basically declaring that it's in on this new effort called anti-racism. And that sort of thrust into public view in a way that hadn't been there before, that our colleges and universities are dominated by this perspective. I think the other thing that happened in the wake of those riots was that Nicole Hannah-Jones, who was the author of the 1619 Project, its main author and editor, came out with a statement in which she said, yeah, we'll call them the 1619 riots. So there was this sort of direct, immediate, visceral connection between the disorder in our cities and the killing of police and burning of shops and that sort of thing, and an audacious claim about what our history actually is. And I can say more about that, no doubt I will, but I'll stop there.
What do you think's going on, Dr. Frazier, in terms of history? You've been standing there by Texas history for most of your career. Have you seen a wave like this before in terms of blowback against the Texas story?
You know, the Texas story is just the latest round, and it's a way of trying to localize national trends. Texas is the big prize. One of the things that's going to happen in this next couple of decades is we're probably going to double the population of this state. And that means, say, by 2050, this will be the big political prize for all of American politics. And so both camps want to make sure that Texas is there in their camp. So as a result, you have to destabilize Texas as it identifies now. So I think there is a new urgency. You know, back in the old days, let's say late 19th century, Texas was just a great big glorified Alabama. And then one day they discovered oil. And then Texas mattered. And the 20th century was essentially the Texas century. The 21st century is certainly going to be a Texas century, and that's what everybody's, I think people understand that. And so you take a look at the strong institutions or the strong Texas story elements, the Alamo, which we're going to hear about shortly, the Texas Rangers. There's been a number of works here recently that are trying to pull those props out from that Texas story of self-sufficiency, the Texas story of a can-do attitude of getting things done. Now then, clearly the Texas story is not pristine. There are things in Texas history that, you know, everybody in this room, everybody watching, wishes didn't happen. But like anything else, these all help give us a frame of reference for what not to do, so that when we do what we should do, it looks so much better. So I think that the shift in demographics, the increase in population, the new sort of clout that Texas is going to have in ways that it even hasn't had up to this point, all make this extraordinarily acute. This is now the pointy end of this spear. And that's why you see things heating up, in my opinion. So Texas has not always been loved. I find that hard to believe. But if you take a look at books in the 60s, you've got Giant. That was a big send-up of Texas. And Texans all said, you know what? That book is great. And they embraced it and made Edna Ferber so mad. And then there was a book called The Super Americans back in the 60s. So this is just the latest iteration of people saying, you know, you Texans are backwards and you probably are in the way of, progress, however you define it. So, being in the history business, there's nothing 100% new. This is just the most recent iteration.
Well, I want to talk about history in just a second, but I want to ask Ernesto, we talk about conflict around history. That's in San Antonio, we call that Tuesday.
Yes, we do. I just happen to have the honor and privilege to work at one of the most recognized sites anywhere, at the Alamo. Our name is our brand, and everybody knows us. The problem is that people interpret our story in different ways, and it's the story of the birth of Texas. And I don't mean 1836, I mean 1718. And when we look at that, everything that stems that everybody here says, we are Texan because we are independent. We are willing to fight for what we believe in, starts in 1718 when it's a Spanish province. It evolves over the years, and in 1836, a group of men, some flawed, did a great thing and stood and fought for what they believed in. And recently we've been having to deal with the topic of slavery being the sole purpose of the Texas Revolution. Well, when you look at it as an entirely Mexican Civil War, because that's what this starts out as, well, what is Zacatecas fighting for? What is the Yucatan fighting for? It's not slavery. It's the loss of their rights as states. Texas is no different. So our job now in the 21st century, it was a lot different in the 20th century when I started there. It's now trying to show people why we remember the Alamo in a different way. Because I had the privilege to talk to a group of students. One of them was from Maine. And he says, well, this has nothing to do with me. And I'm like, it's your story. Men from Maine fought at the Alamo, but it's an American story. It's a world story. It's a story it's on a world stage. And when they left, they were like, wow, I am included. Yes, we include everyone. The main narrative that everybody knows about the 13 days, where does it come from? It comes from Joe. So the traditional Alamo story is technically a slave narrative. He tells William Fairfax Gray and the rest of the members of the convention what he saw. And that becomes what we all study in books today. What we're doing now is trying to add to it through recent acquisitions of documents, because we want people to get the full story and understand that this conflict is something bigger than Texas.
So we are getting from Hannah Nicole Jones, the idea that there's just two narratives. There's the black narrative and the white narrative. And what actually was going on, Dr. Wood, at the time in terms of the debate about slavery, 1619, what was happening, what happened in 1620? When this is not like she has called the country a slavocracy, and Texas has been called a slavocracy.
Well, there's the history itself, which is what actually happened in the year 1619. And she gets that pretty much wrong in that she takes it as the beginning of slavery in the New World. It's wrong in both directions. Slavery had already been in the New World, practiced by native peoples, practiced by the Spanish, and even in what was later to become the United States, there was slavery. But it wasn't practiced in Virginia, of all places. Instead, a English pirate ship, which had intercepted a slave convoy headed towards Mexico, captured some slaves, sold most of them in Bermuda, and had 20-some, we don't know the exact number, left over. They decided they would try to sell them in Virginia, and Virginia said, well, we don't have slavery here, but we'll take your people if you want us to. And they traded them for supplies and turned those individuals into indentured servants. And a few years later, they were set free. They intermarried with the white population. They became landowners. They were not slaves. So we begin with Hannah Jones's false narrative of what happened in 1619. Why 1619? Well, the event of the arrival of the slaves on the ship, the White Lion, was well known by historians. Anybody who does colonial history already knew about it, so she wasn't breaking any news there. What she really wanted was a date that rhymed with 2019, so she could say 400 years. That's a pretty flimsy reason for a historian to claim immense significance for that particular date. Well, what does she want to get out of this? She wants to get out of it that America was founded in oppression, that the enslavement of people of color was the sort of signal event that said this is America, and that all the ideals that Americans had developed since that time rest on hypocrisy and a false bottom. The idea that liberty is important has to be now set aside because we know that liberty was just an excuse for enslaving people. Now, slavery did, of course, come to Virginia about 50, 60 years later. But, you know, when you're telling history, facts matter, and it would have been a good thing had the New York Times and its fact checkers seen fit to say, well, if you're going to tell the story, tell it straight. Instead, what we're getting out of the 1619 project and out of many other pieces of this discussion is this willingness to play fast and loose with the facts. We academics sometimes call that postmodernism. It's the creation of narratives, a narrative being not history, but a story that we like to tell ourselves and that we like to hear. So Nicole Hannah-Jones, with the backing of the New York Times, and now with tens of thousands of American school teachers buying into it as well, has become this new narrative of how we began and who we are.
Yeah, if you were listening to Chris, from the beginning, the 1619 project that the New York Times put out always had a curriculum with it. So that was their goal to do that. But we've been debating about slavery a long time. Don, what was the debate about slavery when Texas was being formed? There was a lot of pro-slave sentiment, pro-slavery sentiment.
Absolutely. I mean, and you have to understand that Texas was the big potential when it was being settled. And it was a potential economic windfall for people that could harness the assets, harness the energy, harness the natural resources of Texas. And the people that understood that included people that had been born and raised in Mexico and people that were born and raised in Tennessee. So how do you make these acres? Because one of the things that is a constant in Texas history is that we have miles and miles of miles and miles. And so how do you use all this to the good? And the absolute booming industry at the time, and it was only going to get hotter, was cotton. Cotton was what everybody was after. Well, how do you raise cotton efficiently? You use it with enslaved labor. And that was essentially the status quo. So there were people saying, you know what, Texas would be a great place to import slaves. There were others that were going, you know, we're not going to get into the cotton economy. We're going to go into Texas and we're going to raise livestock. There's others that take a look at Texas and say, you know what, with a little bit of dredging, there might be some pretty good ports here. And so you had people from up north, you had people from down south, you had people from Germany saying, you know what, I'll go to Texas because nobody will shoot at me here. A little misguided, but as it turns out, or they came from Ireland and said, you know, I'm tired of living so close to the margins in Ireland. I think I can spread out some in Texas. So there's a lot of motivations, and it is spread across every sort of creed and belief system and ethnicity. What ends up happening and how slavery ends up having such an outsized influence on early Texas is that Texas is attached to the Old South geographically. And so when Texas becomes real estate that you can count on, I mean, you're one of the big issues, and Ernesto will speak to this better than I can, about moving to Texas is you can't trust the government. And so if you're going to move your entire family and fortune to Mexican Texas, you're hoping that they're as good as their word. And the problem is the government in Mexico ends up being a moving target. And so people are a little worried about that. There's some reticence to invest in Texas when Texas is independent and when Texas has essentially the protection of the United States guaranteeing its independence. Southerners start taking a look at it and saying, man, this is going to be a great outlet. This is going to be a good place for us to move our cotton operations. This is going to be a good place to sell our surplus slave population, our enslaved workers. So in short, Texas ends up getting swamped by a cotton wave in the 1850s. That has all sorts of implications and ramifications. But in 1836, when these guys that Ernesto studies and essentially teaches the world about are taking their stand at the Alamo, all that's in the future. You know, it's pretty easy to sit here in hindsight and say, wow, you know, this is what everybody was thinking. Heck, I'm in a room with people that are my contemporaries, and I have no idea what you guys are thinking. I'm just not that omniscient. And I certainly can't figure out what all these dead people were thinking, other than by reading their mail, which is what I do for a living, read dead people's mail. And so you end up knowing what the dead people letter writers were thinking, but you can't make these sweeping generalities. And that's what that's a lot of what's going on now, is we want to speak in very sweeping terms. It's a sociological approach as opposed to a historical approach. And that's that's the conundrum. That is the complicating thing about the slave history of Texas. Hey, everybody here understands that slavery's a terrible idea. You know, slavery's probably more vibrant now than it ever has been historically. If you want to eradicate slavery, I would say that the field is wide open right now, globally. So slavery is pretty much frowned upon. Nobody is pro-slavery. And that portion of the Texas story becomes problematic when you take modern sensibilities and try to project them into the past.
So Ernesto, talk to us about what was happening in Mexico, because a lot of what I'm reading is that Mexico was that they were on the side of right through the whole thing, and all the Americans who had come down were on the side of slavery. So what was going on down there?
So looking at the way people came into Texas, right? Originally, you have to come in and you have to have a letter of good standing. You have to promise to be Roman Catholic and become a Mexican citizen. You know, those are your criteria. And you must follow the law. And Mexico's like, this is a great thing. We'll get people to protect our borders from the U.S. Well, doesn't work out as well, right? Because first group show up, next group comes in and doesn't follow those rules. And you have what is typically called las leyes vulgares, right? The vulgar laws. You only obey the law when the government's watching. So you have relatives show up and, well, they just move in. Well, Mexico is at this time is in crisis, like it's been before that. But you have presidencies that are falling constantly. And you have the rise of one gentleman, Vicente Guerrero, who is one of the first people of color to be elected president. And he does some sweeping changes, right? He outlaws slavery, and he does a lot of things which are overturned when he's kicked out because it doesn't help the Mexican government to alienate the newcomers into Texas. They also have a totally different idea, and that's the debt peonage, right? The hacendados. And that's one thing that we tend to forget. That's another form of slavery, where you work for someone and it's like, well, you owe me money. And then all of a sudden it's like, well, you still owe me money because you ate food, so I have to charge you for that. I gave you a pair of pants. I have to charge you for that. And so you never get out of that. And that system continues on. And so what we're dealing with now is people are saying, well, Mexico outlawed slavery and it was bad. Well, yeah, we all know it's a moral issue and it is bad. But did they outlaw it? No, because you have people that are living in San Antonio, in Gonzales, and other parts of Texas that are still continuing that peonage system. It continues way in, I'm going to be honest, and some people were still going to the company store when you were working for someone in South Texas up till recently. It's the way that it worked. The business was, you work for me, I'll give you credit at my store, I'll buy a pair of pants for $1, sell it to you for 10. So you never get out of that cycle of poverty. And it continued on. Think about the Mexican Revolution 1910. What's Zapata fighting for? Totally different thing than Villa up north, right? Villa is fighting for Villa, and Zapata is fighting for the land of the people down south, right? It's like, why are we working for someone else? And so what happens to those two men? Well, one is assassinated in 1918, the other one in 23. But the ideas continue on. Why do people flee to Texas in the teens into the early 1920s? Well, there's war. Why do people come here? What happens in Texas? There's a fear that starts, right? You have this fear of people coming north because what are they going to do? They're going to bring that war with them. We talked about other things that I've noticed that with some of the scholarship that has come out recently, they tend to say that people that wrote history back in the 19th century and early 20th century did not include everyone. And I was just talking to Dr. Frazier and telling them that I was rereading Francis W. Johnson's book that was compiled by Barker. And he's talking about the siege and battle of Bear, and he starts talking about the men that are leading the charge. He never mentions anyone by race. He mentions them by name. And that's what we all do, right? I don't walk around and introduce myself by my race. I introduce myself by my name, who I am. And, you know, you tend to do that, and Francis W. Johnson did it. Others have done it, but this new movement, unfortunately, tends to focus on a person's color and not what they contribute and what they do. And that's a really sad thing for me, because I look at people as people, and we all tend to have one thing in common. We're flawed. But what we do to go against that flaw is what makes us remembered. And at the Alamo, there's 189 men that we remember because they overcame that flaw. And they did something great for a fledgling nation.
I want to ask about that a little bit more, Dr. Woods. One of the things that was stunning to me about your book was that there was a lot of academic blowback, even on the left, against 1619. It's not like she got by with it.
Right. One of the early counter movements came from the World Socialist Daily, which was old-style Marxists who believe in class revolution, and they were really put out by the idea that the great revolution that the Times was going to foment was based on identity and not on class. So racializing the left was bad news for them. And they did the remarkable thing of going out and finding probably about a dozen of the most prominent historians of America. Not all of them Americans, some were British, one was from New Zealand, but very well-known people in the field, and just sort of opening up an interview with them in which they could say whatever they wanted. So we ended up in this odd source, the World Socialist Daily, with a compilation of statements by major American historians, all of whom were incensed by what the New York Times, Nicole Hannah-Jones, had done. And they weren't alone in this. There were other historians that, like Sean Mullens, who wasn't part of that, who came in with his own declarations about how far from historical accuracy they had wandered. In my book, I compiled all those things and more, but the point being that the honest historians, the people who had devoted their entire careers to studying American history and who would not venture any statement at all that they couldn't back up with careful documentation, those people were completely put out by the 1619 Project. And yet, somehow, I wouldn't say it didn't make any difference, but didn't do anything to stop the infusion of the 1619 Project into the American school curriculum. The teachers' unions embraced it. Teachers themselves embraced it. Now, there's a mystery there to be grappled with by ordinary Americans. Looking at your schools, why would the teachers, the intellectual authorities over your children, be so eager to take up a false narrative and to reject the actual narrative of American history? Not that the actual narrative of American history is such a simple, straightforward thing. Clearly, slavery and oppression and various forms of other mistreatment are part of that history and need to be told. These historians were all in on that. They wanted to tell a history that had warts and all of America, but our teachers aren't listening to that. Now, why is that? My own answer is that most of those teachers had been through our schools of education, which are in the American university system probably the most radicalized part of the faculty. And so the teachers themselves had been subjected to something on the order of the 1619 Project, call it critical race theory or diversity, equity, inclusion. These ideas had been in play for a long time. The American public just didn't realize how deeply that had saturated the minds of our teachers. Now, of course, I talk to a lot of teachers. Not all of them believe this stuff, but enough of them do, and they're dominant enough in our schools that that's where we get this current division between the public, which wants to see our history told straight, and our teachers, the majority of whom seem to buy into teaching a history of racial division as the primary fact about what America is. Along with the racial division comes a demoralization of America. This is an attempt to say, you're worthless people. If you're white, you're guilty. If you're black, you're either with us or you're possessed by false consciousness. There's a whole lot of rhetoric that goes into all of this, most of which turns the 1619 Project and the other things like it into a psychodrama. This is supposed to be therapy for America. We're finally going to liberate you from your demons of denial about who you really are. And instead, we're getting this complete fabrication of what we really are.
And it's kind of like where we began. It's as if these discussions just started happening. Ernesto pointed out slavery is a moral evil. They knew that in 1620 when they got here. They certainly knew it when we were forming America. There were certainly debates there. I was wondering, Don, if you could talk about the constitutional debates in Texas and the time between the independence, our statements of independence, and then the Texas Constitution, and what the slavery debate was like.
Absolutely. And you got to understand that the U.S. Constitution, I view it as a commercial document. And the idea behind the Constitution was to create a government that established a scaffolding for everybody to pursue their happiness. And that's what was being carried in the cranium of all these people moving to Texas between 1836 and statehood in 1846. And certainly beyond. I mean, these guys are carrying their Constitution in their pocket, as was recommended by a Mexican observer in 1828, I think. And so these guys believed that they were coming to Texas to pursue their happiness. Now, part of that pursuing their happiness meant that they had to be able to make a living using the state of the art of the time, the absolute state of the art of the time. So that included using agricultural labor that was enslaved to make their particular happiness. Now then, that said, it doesn't make any sense when you're thinking about slavery and all the nuances and the intricacies of it to think that slavery was going to, or slave owners were incentivized to be cruel. Now, some of them were cruel, but they're actually more incentivized to make sure that their people were healthy, that they could actually do the job at hand, and that they could make them some money. So slavery, as imperfect as it was what everybody was doing. Now, that doesn't mean if all the kids were doing it, you should do it. But that was part of it. And if the Constitution is, in fact, a scaffolding for you to pursue your economic interest, and slavery is essentially recognized as maybe distasteful but legal, then that migrates into Texas because the majority of the people that move in after statehood are already involved in that system.
Well, there were, though, abolitionists
Absolutely.
At the Alamo and in other places. So
Gail Borden's a great example of that. I mean, Gail Borden is one of the great early names in Texas, and he was a very vocal critic of slavery, and finally moved his operation to Connecticut, and then after the American Civil War comes back to Texas and starts schools to educate the formerly enslaved. So there is always voices saying, look, slavery is probably a bad idea. And during the course of the American Civil War, there's a very strong Texas Unionist element. Now, a bunch of them get chased out, but a bunch of them actually join the Union Army and come back and put in a few licks of their own. And so it's a extraordinarily complicated thing, but as Americans, we like our history to fit on a bumper sticker. Reading books is hard. I don't know if you run into that. But if you ask your kids, hey, I need you to whittle through these 600 pages, on the ins and outs of slavery, their eyes roll back in their head and they start frothing at the mouth, and it's just awful to behold. And so what they want is something that they can just turn into a slogan. And as a result, the people that are pushing these alternative views of the American and Texas experience understand that. I was just reading a Scientific American article that said that, hang on to your hats. The young are susceptible to false narratives online. I know. You may want to write this down, Ernesto. And so we usually think of that as being, some sort of right-wing, fake news sort of stuff. At least that was the take. But false narratives are false narratives. It doesn't matter where on the spectrum they're coming from. And our kids are not particularly well equipped to discern between what's right and what's not right. And we've got a system set up where, you really can't debate the fine points of a bunch of these issues in your classrooms. Colleges, absolutely. Let's have these debating societies. But in 8th grade, what the teacher said is what I'm going to put on my exam, and then that's what the standardized test is going to test me over. And as a result, we've had, 2, 3 generations of school kids that have been essentially exposed to these other narratives. And if you say, wait, you guys are slightly off on your interpretation, usually what I get is a student that says, my teacher said you were going to say that. Oh, well, okay. And so, that's exactly what we expected from you, is that you would be pushing back against this truth that teacher gave me. But I've seen this since the 1990s. There was my major professor in graduate school wrote an article called What's Wrong with History? And he said, there's absolutely nothing wrong with history, but what's happening is people are manipulating history. And this is what it's going to look like 30 years hence. And it was a very prescient piece, as it turns out. I don't know, I probably went way down a different rabbit trail than you were looking for, but that's kind of where we are, state of the art.
Well, before we leave the issue of slavery, Ernesto, can you just talk about the 189 and where they were on the issue?
Well, there were men that had slaves at the Alamo, but the number there was small. But immediately, who are the ones that actually have them? It's the big names, right? People recognize, right? Especially 2 of them. You have Bowie and Travis. And immediately people are like, well, they all own slaves. Well, no, it's like the Civil War. Not everybody was fighting for slavery. They were fighting because, well, guess what? My state needs me. And that's the thing that we tend to forget. Many of these people came to Texas because there was an opportunity. Many of them came to Texas at the outbreak of war because there was an opportunity. How are we paying people to join the Texas Army? Land, and land is wealth. And so if you want to survive, you need land. Whether it's just you and your family, you can grow crops, you can have animals. And so it was a way of survival. And so people saw this opportunity. A lot of the men that were here or there at the Alamo, because I tend to forget that I'm not there right now. But a lot of people at the Alamo, they were there for different reasons, right? One was to fight, because a lot of them were like, I'm here for this fight. Others were there because it's like, I live in San Antonio. I've seen what has happened when the government comes through and basically wipes out the town. We need to fight for our rights as citizens. And then it shifts, right? It's like, we need to now fight for our rights for this new country that's going to be founded. And people are always saying, well, the Alamo defenders didn't know that this was going to happen. And it's like, they had delegates at the convention, so they went to represent them in the cause of an independent nation. So they were aware. It's one of those issues that the small minority of men that had slaves is being pushed to the forefront of the majority that did not, and that's one of those sad things, because history is messy. History is not pretty. Bad things happen all the time. Good things happen as well. And our job is to go through everything and try to make a story that will allow people to get both sides and make their own conclusions. And we don't want to dictate. We want you to think and come up with your own ideas. So it's been a struggle, but we're continuing to move in that line because our job is to be able to provide the resources for you to make your own conclusion.
Okay, history guys, we've got about 5 minutes before we take questions, so I'm pretty depressed now. How do we fix this? How do we fix this? The 1619 is going to be a movie. The authors of Forget the Alamo, they won't talk to us, so I suspect they're working on a movie deal. What do we do?
We look to Virginia, where this started. The good parents in Virginia have risen up and told their school boards that they don't want a fake history in their classes. They don't want this emphasis on attempting to divide people by race and to incentivize resentment and guilt. They want to have a form of education that is in some sense wholesome, and being attached to the pursuit of truth is part of that. Now, what happened in Virginia happened to a lesser degree in New Jersey and where I'm from, New York, and other places around the country. Lots of people are predicting that the momentum of that movement is going to come into this year's midterm elections. I'm all for it. There's got to be an element here of a populist reaction against the misappropriation of our history, which is what has taken place. Are there other things we can do? Well, when I'm out speaking on talk radio and things like that, I frequently urge my audiences to go out and start reading some history books themselves. Your children will not know history from what they're getting in the classrooms of public schools. But if you know some history, and it's not that hard to become acquainted with the basic facts, and start talking about it to your children, they will begin to get that counterbalance. I should say, some of the central issues here are really not that complicated. Nicole Hannah-Jones and company insist, they have just taken their 100-page original thing and turned it into I think it's a 600-page book, and not given an inch on this. They insist that the American Revolution was fought by the Patriots in order to perpetuate the institution of slavery in the colonies. The Patriots, by this account of, were fearful that the British were going to emancipate the slaves and end the system of slavery. So we owe our independence as a nation to the desire to enslave people and continue oppression. There is not one scintilla of truth in that. It didn't happen that way. We know why the American Revolution was fought. We probably know more about that event in our history than anything other than the Alamo, and that's because we have the Declaration of Independence, which lays out 20-some reasons why we were rebelling. We have the letters, the newspapers, we have thick documentation, and not once in the whole decade of that revolution was there a hint by any American that we need to do this because the British are going to take slaves away from us. It's just completely made up. And yet, that's what's being taught in our schools.
Well, in the state of Texas, we've got to come up with a curriculum that is inclusive, that tells this Texas story about ideas, because really that's what people came here thinking were these great ideas of what this place could be. And we need to lean into that story. But one of the big challenges, we talked about demographic shifts. The third most spoken language in Texas right now is Vietnamese. And then after that, it's Mandarin. Then after that, it's Tagalog. So we need to be very mindful of this Texas story that we tell, to where it is relevant to some kid whose family came in from Manila. As they're standing outside of the Alamo, they need to understand what the big picture was so that Alamo means something to them. Because Texas is full of all sorts of folks, and they're coming from all over the country and all over the world, and somehow they have to find their story. Natives, newcomers, doesn't matter. They have to find their part of that Texas story, and we need to provide them with a story that is optimistic and captures the fact that Texas is probably the best expression of the American ideal. And I firmly believe that. So I think if we end up telling the positive story of Texas, I think that that may start to serve as an antidote for the spreading venom.
Yes, what he said. No, yeah, I agree. We need to provide people the resources to learn. Unfortunately, we live in a society today where all they want to see is a 30-second clip or a post that is 100 characters. And our job is to try to entice them to come back to actual documents, to come back to books that are written. You know, it's great, always great to read one book that has one side and the other, and then make up your own mind. That's what we need to go back to. We need to go back to the idea of actually processing information and making it your own and making up your own mind. And I know that Dr. Frazier is busy with that, working to try to fix some of the issues in the curriculum. And I wholly support this idea that we need to provide people the resources to learn on their own and be able to make up their own mind.
And and you can also go to the Alamo very often. We at DPPF, we'd like to figure out a way that every Texas school child spends time in the Alamo. And every time we bring it up, people say, well, what about El Paso? It's a long way from El Paso, but... But did you get to go? Did you get to have a trip? Great, great. We're ready for questions and answers. They're shining this light into us as if we're being interrogated by the police. So it's hard to see hands. I see one right there. Yes?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Sorry. This question is for Mr. Wood. You mentioned earlier indentured servants in colonial times and black indentured servants that were freed. And so I was just curious, when did the colonies move away from indentured servants in general and move to slavery? Why did they do that, and what happened to freed black slaves or freed black indentured servants when that happened?
Well, I don't know all the answers to those questions. Virginia created a legal system of slavery in the, if I'm remembering correctly, I think it's the 1670s. The other southern states were doing so. All of the colonies at one point, all the original British colonies in North America, permitted slavery early on, but the northern states abolished it fairly quickly. I think Pennsylvania was the first to abolish it altogether. Slavery was still a pretty marginal institution until the 1790s. That's more than 100 years later than that. With the invention of the cotton gin, Eli Whitney's invention, which suddenly made cotton production economically feasible on a larger scale. And with the invention of the cotton gin, slavery in the southern cotton-growing states became a much bigger deal. What happened to the individuals who had been emancipated early on is that they just stayed emancipated unless they had the misfortune of being caught by these essentially criminal gangs that went around kidnapping people and taking them to the south and selling them. So there was always this sort of syndicate model of slavery capturing free people and putting them into slavery. But people, including blacks in the South, could be free and have a legal status, although it came with disabilities. I should say, just as part of this answer, that we're talking about slavery as though it's this thing that happened long ago. It's far from the case. Slavery is happening right now. It's happening in the United States. We frequently talk about people being traded for sex. A lot of those people are enslaved. Probably a fair number of us in this room are wearing some article of clothing that was manufactured by slave labor in China, by the Uyghurs or other groups. Slavery in Africa is still a booming business. It's something that we are at pains to deny and look the other way, but human slavery is not one of those evils that has disappeared just because we know it's wrong. Anyway, I'll leave it at that.
Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. My family is actually new to Texas, refugees from California, a place that used to be a really great place to live. And actually now, here in Texas, it feels like California used to be 25, 30 years ago. But my kids are all just coming out of the college process here in Texas, and I noticed that they had to take on Texas history as part of the process, which I love that, because in California, not by requirement, but just by habit, kids in the 4th grade go to Sacramento. And so here, I was just curious, as we're trying to protect the information that is shared about Texas, and I see it as a requirement to get through colleges, who has control of that? Is that just kind of open to school districts, or is that something that is a point of, obviously, if everybody's going through that channel, seems like that'd be a great place to make sure it's getting taught right.
You asked the right question, Dr.
Yeah, you hit the sweet spot just now. So I'm a content advisor to the TEA, and so that gave me an opportunity to see how the sausage gets ground in terms of curriculum development in the state of Texas. Historically, 7th grade was where Texas history was taught, and that was kind of a rite of passage. I mean, I had Texas history with Mr. Burney, at Nichols Junior High in Arlington, Texas. So I remember those lessons, and I remember that event. Now, from time to time, Texas reevaluates how it does deliver Texas history. Right now, it's 4th grade and 7th grade. The problem is it's not tested in any of the standardized tests. And as a result, it is very precious real estate in terms of preparing the students to take a standardized exam, which is administered in 8th grade. So 8th grade U.S. history becomes critical. 7th grade Texas history oftentimes is seen as an afterthought. And so one of the things that we've been trying to address is how exactly do we approach this idea that Texas should remain a very important and robust part of the K through 12 education experience. And I was an active advocate for that. And what happens is the advisors make their statement. Now, of course, you can take it or leave it because we're advisors. But then it goes to work groups, and the working groups help to come up with the nouns and verbs of the state standards, and the State Board of Education is guiding that process. It's their hands on the tiller. So I can tell you that there's been lots of conversations over the last 6 weeks about this very issue. How do we tell the Texas story and tell it in a relevant way for future generations? Because you're right, it's important that we continue telling this story, but if we tell it as a one-off, then the Alamo becomes this quirky little thing that happened in San Antonio. And Sam Houston is just this guy from Tennessee that did some, weird and wacky stuff. But it doesn't fit into a larger American narrative. Again, I'll come back to the idea that Texas is the best expression of the American idea. And I'd also say that Texas is the part of Mexico that works. And with the change in demographics, it's kind of a big deal. The kids in your class are going to have a completely different heritage than the people in your class that may take their ancestry back to Jamestown or Plymouth. And so how do you get that part of Texas to sing its part of the song? Because it's a great song. We're organically diverse. We don't have to force it here. We inherited it. It's part of our birthright. And so we need to tell that story in a way that's inclusive of all these different voices. And the only thing that unifies all of these various voices is the ideals. What do we stand for? Well, Texas is a 10th Amendment state. We believe in the sovereignty of a state. And we understand what federal overreach looks like and overregulation may look like. You guys especially know it, coming from California. And it's these sorts of ideas, this sort of structure that has created the kind of place where everybody wants to move to and not move from, that we need to preserve in that education process. And by golly, we're working on it, and hopefully it sticks.
Did you want to add anything to that, Ernesto? Did you take 4th and 7th grade?
Yes, I took 4th, 7th at the university. Still taking it now. But it's one of those things that, unfortunately, the way that we are taught history is read a chapter, take a test, and forget what you just learned because that's not important. You already tested on it. And that's not the way things work. And we need to move so that people understand that all history is connected. And that's what we're lacking. And that's what I hope we are able to do. And I tell people all the time, all history is connected. And I tend to go on and on and on and on. But it's one of those things. I believe in it because what's happening on one side of the planet is going to affect people on this side of the planet. And we are all one people. And so everybody's story matters, and we're all connected by a common thread, and it's our humanity. And that's the way that we need to look at history. You know, what happens in the U.S. changes the course of history in Europe. And then it comes back full circle, and it changes the course of history in Mexico, and it leads to the independence movement in 1810, which leads to Texas independence in 36, which leads to the Mexican-American War, or Mexican War, or the first war of northern aggression. Depends on what you want to call it. But it's all connected. And until we start doing that, we're not going to move forward.
Let's do over here. Can you see her sign of how much time we've got?
My question is primarily for Dr. Frazier, although if anyone else wants to weigh in, feel free. As the left's historical narrative has become increasingly racialized in the last few years, we have seen the emergence of a sort of newish phrase, BIPOC, B-I-P-O-C, stands for Black Indigenous People of Color. Now, we've had a lot of discussion to this point about some of the experiences of the Black community in Texas and some of the Mexican. Would you care to comment on the indigenous peoples of Texas, and please include the origin of the phrase Comanche Moon in your answer?
Well, I would argue that you don't have American history without the indigenous peoples of North America. You don't have Texas history without the indigenous peoples of Texas. And there's a great book I would recommend. I'm giving a shout out to the book, War of a Thousand Deserts, in which the author makes the argument that if it wasn't for the Comanche Nation, the Comanche Empire, that you wouldn't have had circumstances that favored Texas independence, that favored an American victory, early victories in the U.S.-Mexican War. So it's absolutely critical. Now, Comanche Moon is just that first nice autumn moon that's big and bright, so bright you can read a newspaper by it, where you would go out and provender for your winter camp, which included moving livestock and essentially providing for your Comanche family. So Comanches are driving so much of Texas history that it's crazy to ignore them. But let's not leave out, Cherokees and Shawnee immigrant Indians, the Alabama Coushatta, Kickapoos. I mean, there's plenty to talk about there. And again, that started sort of that organic diversity I was talking about in Texas history.
We have 5 minutes, so if we've got, there are a couple more questions. Yes, sir.
So much of Texas history is absorbed, unfortunately these days, not simply by reading about it, but by watching it in terms of video. And so my question really is, based on some of the things that have come out, what would you, many of us learned about it back in the Disney days of the Alamo and elsewhere, but based on more recent, both with streaming and YouTube and of course Hollywood, what would you say are the best and most accurate descriptions of Texas in film and TV and media?
Sure.
And what are some of the more problematic ones that you've exposed to?
Yeah, anything that's filmed about Texas in New Mexico, I would step away from, or in Monument Valley. Well, I mean, one of the things that I've done, because I understand that the wave of the future is video, is I put all of my Texas history content up online for free. The Don Frazier channel, I mean, shameless plug. We're going to have a Texas Center channel that we start doing a lot of content on. I just poached a guy from KXAN, and he's now my creative content producer. So we understand that if we're going to get these stories told, we got to tell them digitally, and we got to be good visual storytellers. And you're exactly right. That is kind of where it's going. And that is how you terraform public opinion, is by giving them things that they can tune into and consume in 15 minutes or fewer, or 5 minutes or fewer if you've got a really short attention span. They got to be compelling, got to be well written, and they got to be visually beautiful. And so that's what we're working on. Now, the conversation about, which are the best movies and things like that, might as well ask me what the best barbecue is.
That's for after the panel. We'll do that.
Absolutely.
And of course, TPPF is working on Forging Texas. If you haven't seen any of that, get with me afterwards, and I'll let you know when we're showing it and how you can find it online. The lady in the second row that's had her hand up, I want to make sure we get her before we go. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, this is actually kind of a follow-up on what he asked. I really prefer the long versions, and so I was wondering if there are a few books you would recommend. I read 13 Days to Glory, many of the old books, which now they're saying are mostly false or whatever, or have a lot of falsehoods, but that probably means the opposite. But do you have a few books that you actually would recommend for people that like to either listen to it on Audible or else read?
Let's get everybody's recommend. Let's do that as the wrap.
Great.
Good.
So for the Texas Revolution and Republic, I recommend a book by Stephen L. Hardin called Lust for Glory. It's nice. It's 60 very digestible pages or chapters, short chapters. But then you're going to fall into one of two camps. You're either in the Fehrenbach camp, or you're going to be in the Big Beautiful Thing camp. And that big old doorstop is a big old thick book. So if you can wade through it, it's got a lot of cool stuff in it. Yeah, Lust for Glory is good. That's kind of the introductory primer I would recommend.
Dr. Wood, what do you read?
Pass on that one, 'cause I don't read Texas history.
Well, no. Just what history book are you reading?
The author is Steve Hardin, Lust for Glory.
No, Dr. Wood, tell us what you're reading or what you recommend. Think everybody should read.
I'd read his book.
Yeah, read.
1620.
1620.
1620.
I always leave them with the product.
Okay, well, never mind that. I think I'd recommend McDougall's Freedom Around the Corner as a history book that has meant a lot to me. Walter McDougall, I think it is. McDougall. One of the historians can help me out here.
Not this one.
So one of the books that I'm going to recommend was written by my old boss, and it's Sacrifice at the Alamo, and it's actually very good because he connects the dots between Revolution in 1810 running through, and he explains things, and it's very readable. One of the things that we've been working at the Alamo to do is bring back a book club. So our staff is reading we're reading books. And if you want to know about the big Three Roads to the Alamo is a great book. It's Three Roads to the Alamo, and you can read it by just finding Crockett and reading everything on Crockett, or you can read it from one part to the other. There's another book that it's more of a, I wouldn't even say coffee table book. It's a reference book, and I just got word the other day that it's going back into publication, and it is the Alamo Reader and its primary sources, so that you can read the accounts from the letters and items from Travis, Bowie, Defenders, the Mexican side, newspaper articles. That's all in there, and it's and I just, like I said, I just heard that it's being redone in a paperback form, so it's going to be back out. It's not a read from one end to the other. It's a reference source, but it's a really great book. And I'm going to say that, going back to the other question about media, a lot of our groups of people that would come to the Alamo started out with either Fess Parker or John Wayne. That's it. That's how Phil started his collecting and love for the passion for the Alamo. And it's I look at media in the Hollywood sense as a gateway into Texas history, because it makes you want to read more. It brings up questions, and the more you read, the more questions you have. And that's always great, because the more you question, the more you learn. And so those are my 2 cents.
So Dr. Wood has his book. He can show you now.
Dr. Richard Bruce Winders.
So Dr. Wood has a copy of 1620. So this is what it looks like. Oh.
This one, as far as I know.
Yeah.
I'll escort you to your car. She looks a little, dangerous now. Hit you in the head and take that book.
Thank you all so much. I want to make one recommendation. It's a little bit different, but I just finished a book called Juneteenth, and it was written by Annette Gordon Reed, who is an African-American Thomas Jefferson scholar, who is actually a Texan from Conroe. Pretty tough reading, but it's a short book and an important piece of Texas history that I didn't have. Thank you all so much. We love it.